Yeah, it was a very interesting start to what I hope will be a very interesting session. My name is Adrian Sell. I am Chief Executive of the Oxfordshire Community Foundation. We are here today to talk, as you probably know, about homelessness and the Oxfordshire Homeless Movement. We will start with some speakers in a minute, but before we get on to that, I just wanted to talk through a short update on the Community Resilience Fund, which, as you know, we have raised over £1 million and we have now spent over £600,000. That has gone out to over 130 organisations locally. Most recently, last week, we were paying out small and vital grants to frontline community organisations, small grants up to £2,000 for very frontline organisations providing food, advice, medicines and other support to people who still need it as we continue to be locked down, isolating and starting to see increasing economic impacts from the pandemic and the lockdown. Oxfordshire Homeless Movement started 3 or 4 years ago with a kind of call for help from the Oxford City Council, who knew that there was a hugely complex problem and a huge array of organisations trying to address that problem in a multitude of different ways. They approached us as Oxfordshire Community Foundation asking if we might be able to do something to help bring together some of the organisations working in the sector and trying to improve coordination and collaboration. This led to something called the City Conversation, and a lot of the organisations whose logo who were involved in that are featured on this slide. And that has led to the creation of Oxford Homeless Movement and to the growth of that movement and some of its successes, which you'll hear about through the course of the webinar. To a point now where it's becoming Oxfordshire Homeless Movement and trying to address the challenges in a county-wide way. We have a much greater array of organisations involved today, and there is independent leadership of that forum through a steering group, a chair, Jane Cranston, who you'll hear a little bit from later. And we are proud as Oxfordshire Community Foundation to provide the platform for that group to be trying to do the great work that they're trying to do. We have a number of speakers today, and in a minute I'll hand over to Imogen Blood, who has been doing a lot of work on housing-led the housing-led approach in Oxfordshire and what that would mean for Oxford. After Imogen, I'll then be asking Paul Roberts, CEO of Aspire, a few questions about some of the work they're doing and their support for OHM. And then we will hear from Gregory, someone who's got lived experience of homelessness and why lived experience is so important to be at the heart of the movement and informing the work that we do. And then there will be time for a question and answer session. Please use the chat box that's available before a final word from Jane Cranston, the chair of OHM. A few bits of housekeeping before I hand over to Imogen. I will just unshare my screen so that she can share her screen for her slides. If you could mute yourself so that we don't get interruptions of people's pictures coming up whilst speakers are talking. If you're able to change your display name to your actual name and your organisation name, that would really help us see who's here and help other people understand who's here as well. We are recording the session and we'll be using that as playback in various ways to share the learning and information that comes forth today. And do use the chat box to make comments, ask questions, and we will try and pick up some of the questions and comments that are coming up when we get to the Q&A later on. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Imogen Blood, who will talk us through the opportunity we are now facing in Oxfordshire and more widely. Imogen.
Thank you very much. I just, are my slides showing there?
I can see them fine, yes.
Brilliant, just checking. I had a slide sharing and unmuting bit of coordination to be done there. Thank you very much for the introduction, Adrian.
Sorry, Imogen, I can't see them. I don't know if I'll see them.
Okay, let me try again.
I can't either.
Okay, I'll come on. Brilliant, thanks for letting me know. Is that better?
Yeah, that's it.
Yes, I can see them now.
Sorry, that's a yes. I muted myself again. Apologies.
see the slides and hear me, yeah? Brilliant. Great. So thanks for the introduction, Adrian. Yes, I'm an independent social researcher. I was originally a social worker, started my career in hostels and worked as a prison drugs worker before moving into research. And I'm delighted to be here today, almost virtually through the airwaves, to share some of the reflections of the feasibility study that I've been working on in Oxfordshire this year. So the study, for those of you who don't know, was commissioned by all of the councils in Oxfordshire and their partners in health, and was also substantially funded by the homelessness charity Crisis. Although our planned approach took a number of twists and turns in the wake of the pandemic, we have nevertheless been able over the last kind of 9-10 months to gather an enormous amount of data and information. We've been looking at the numbers of people flowing through the homelessness system. We've been looking at the types of provision that exists, the different services, both at community level and commissioned by the council. We've had the opportunity through amazing support from the Lived Experience Advisory Forum, which I know is part of the Oxfordshire Homelessness Movement, to actually get out and do a load of peer research on the streets of Oxford despite the lockdown. So we've heard the voices of lots of people who are experiencing homelessness, and we've also held a whole series of workshops and run surveys to hear from as many people as we can who are living in Oxfordshire, working in the homelessness system, and who have a shared interest in wanting to end homelessness. And we really realised quite early on that actually we needed to be really closely involved in the response to the pandemic, both learning from it and supporting it wherever possible, whilst at the same time trying not to lose sight of the kind of underlying bigger long-term system change piece that we've been brought in to do. It's been quite a juggling act, but I was really keen to kind of have that opportunity to come and share some of my reflections around where we are, I guess, both nationally and locally in relation to that picture. So just a refresh for anyone who doesn't really know very much about the Everyone In initiative. Back in March, obviously when we hit the first kind of period of lockdown, I believe around about 5,500 people were initially accommodated in hotels in England through a huge kind of monumental effort from local authorities up and down the country with government funding. I think by July, the government estimated that number had increased to 15,000. And obviously, you know, huge effort of which the Oxfordshire Homelessness Movement was obviously very heavily involved to try and bring everybody in Oxford and Oxfordshire into hotels, hostel type accommodation, but in self-contained units. And just quite recently, we've had some news that the councils in Oxfordshire have all kind of been successful in winning various amounts of next steps accommodation funding. So loads of kind of activity and energy and success. But where now? I was just kind of reflecting the other day with a number of Crisis's housing coaches up and down the country of where they sort of see the national picture. Obviously, loads has been achieved, but we are left with a number of really substantial challenges as we move forward, and these are shared up and down the country. You know, first of all, there's been as of yet no government decision around what happens for those who were brought into hotels but don't have any recourse to public funds. And I know the movement in Oxfordshire has been really shining a much needed spotlight on that group and trying to find solutions for them, but that isn't a resource that many other parts of the country have. Then there's this real question about what about those who never came indoors in the first place? And that was really flagged up when our peer researcher from the Leaf Group went out and started speaking to people on the streets of Oxford back in July. And really, we had to kind of go back and prompt to find out, did some of these people not know about Everybody In? How come they were still out there? And we realised just, you know, actually that although a huge number of people did come indoors, that is really just the tip of the iceberg. There were many others who, because they happened to be surface surfing at that moment, or they, you know, were out on their tents in Port Meadow, or just for whatever reason didn't like the sound of the offer, chose not to come in. And then, of course, what about the new presentations? One of the housing coaches likened the whole thing to a game of musical statues. You know, it was whoever happened to be out and keen to come in at that moment in March, you know, kind of was, you know, moved into that system. But what do we do with everybody else? You know, how do we try to ripple that out, really? Because what we had there was a snapshot, but it wasn't the whole kind of iceberg. And what do we do? That the big question now on everyone's mind is, what do we do now when the cold weather hits? You know, the public health risks are as high now as they ever were. Do we open the emergency shelters, or do we not? You know, what really difficult decisions to be made there, life and death decisions, lesser of two evil decisions if we don't get significant swathes of funding and some really clear steers around all of that. So there's been enormous progress, and I think one of the most exciting elements of that whole kind of movement from where I've been sitting is that things suddenly feel possible that didn't feel possible before. And I remember sitting there reflecting on that weekend back in March, that actually if we can make a policy decision to more or less end homelessness overnight, then it just goes to remind ourselves that it's a policy decision to have homelessness in the first place. And I think the kind of, you know, the energy and the kind of pulling together to make things happen that I certainly witnessed and to some degree was part of in Oxfordshire, hopefully fills us with huge confidence for what we can achieve moving forwards. But I think these what now challenges just provide a sobering reminder that we're certainly not there yet. So it feels to me that a housing-led, or we can call it rapid rehousing approach, is now more than ever the most important thing that we can do moving forwards. And luckily that's what our study was commissioned to look into the feasibility of doing. So hopefully we can bring it all back together again at this point in time. And basically a housing-led approach believes that moving people into their own homes with the right support as quickly as we can is the best way of ending their homelessness. There's almost nothing there that any of us could disagree with, I don't think. You know, we need, you know, if we want to get people out of homelessness, they need both housing and support. We also, within a housing-led approach, try to reduce as much as possible the need for emergency and a temporary accommodation, which fits really well with the challenges that coronavirus has brought to us thinking about how we manage emergency and temporary accommodation safely. And that's not for a minute suggesting that I think we're not going to need significant amounts of emergency and temporary accommodation moving forwards. The numbers are such that, you know, I can't imagine a transition in which we won't always need quite a substantial amount in a place like Oxford, but hopefully we can work towards reducing that. And then another really key part of a housing-led approach is to try and apply the principles of the Housing First model with its real focus on flexible, strength-based support and on choice and control and rights right across the whole housing and homelessness system. And that's absolutely critical because, you know, when we're looking at the kinds of numbers and the kinds of logistical operations we've, you know, many of us have been thinking about over the recent months, it's easy to start imagining that it's just a question of managing people, of moving them through a system, of kind of quickly matching them, a pure logistical challenge. But actually, you know, what we all really know, if we stop for a moment to think, is that actually that process of exiting homelessness, of reintegrating with society, is actually a huge process of rebuilding your self-esteem, your sense of agency, that, you know, you can't just place somebody in a house and expect it all to come together for them. There's got to be an element of choice and control, even though it feels as though there's so little choice to be afforded in the system. We've got to find a way of bringing that back. So I can't really do justice to the feasibility studies, which are far-ranging and quite broad in a couple of minutes. But reflecting on it all, it just made me think that actually the homelessness system is a bit like a black hole. And it's a bit like a black hole up and down the country. It's not just like this in Oxfordshire. But inevitably, when resources are tight and we've got people kind of literally there, you know, humanitarian crisis in front of us, our resources and our energies get drawn into the very central kind of crisis response at the middle. And when you look at the system that's evolved across Oxfordshire, that's very much what you see. You know, we're pulling a lot of our resources into almost holding people in the centre. And actually, as difficult as though it can seem, we somehow need to refocus our energy on preventing people from becoming homeless in the first place. When we look at the numbers, even from 2018-19, before the kind of pandemic, we saw, you know, over 4,000 single homeless people coming through and into the council systems across Oxfordshire, either at risk or threatened with homelessness or actually homeless. So there's a huge number of people coming through that system potentially. We've got to hold them back out of that black hole, because we know that once we get in there, it's really difficult to get them out. And we've got to stay hugely focused on them trying to exit homelessness so that they, you know, we don't just draw more and more people into this ever more expensive and you know, hard to manage black hole. So my sense is that we can end homelessness if And these are the kind of key things that I think we need to do, and some reflections on where I see the Oxfordshire Homelessness Movement already positioning itself and working towards this. So the kind of headlines for me are that we can end homelessness if we hold each other to account for coordinating individuals' pathways out of homelessness. Now, we're talking a lot at the moment with the councils, and I've just come out of a conversation now with the mental health leaders as well around this idea of a by name approach. At the moment, what we're seeing is that individuals are just kind of dropping out of one bit of the service, and that their case is closed, and then they pop up somewhere else, and nobody's really kind of held that golden thread right the way through. And we're very strongly arguing that we need a kind of coordinated multi-agency case management approach, where we really hold each other accountable to trying to work with that individual to support them out of homelessness. And that really crucially, we share the data and the learning around where that's working and where it's not. And if it's not worked for an individual, that may or may not be the fault of that project. Let's move on. Let's find another route. Let's find another tenancy, another way of trying to support that individual. We can, if we reduce the barriers to social housing for single homeless people. Now, obviously, there isn't enough social housing. There's quite a lot of affordable housing across the county, and there's some serious rethinking about how we shift that balance. But one thing we were also really struck by was just how significant those barriers to social housing are for single homeless people. We met people through the peer research who've been swashing around the homelessness system in Oxfordshire for often decades or more, and aren't on the housing register because at some point it was sort of felt that it probably wasn't worth it, it was too long a wait, or because they had rent arrears dating back from whenever. You know, we need to be getting those people onto the register, onto the waiting list, monitoring that need, and really looking at whether we can change some of those allocations policies to remove some of those barriers. We can, if we can improve access to better quality and more secure private rented accommodation. Affordability is always going to be a challenge in Oxford, but we believe there are things that can really be done to drive up quality and to enforce poor practice. And we're delighted to be hopefully moving forwards and working with Aspire and the Oxfordshire Homeless Movement to look at whether there are ways of introducing an ethical lettings agency model into the current landscape to kind of increase that. We can, if we can offer more flexible support outside of supported housing placements. So we need to be able to provide support that follows the individual for as long as they need it. And that support needs to be gender specific. It needs to take into account the needs of people who have no recourse to public funds. And I know those are both things that are big on your strategic plan. We need, as I mentioned before, to maximise choice and control for people within the system and really recognise the impact of trauma in their lives. And we've been talking a lot over the last couple of weeks around workforce transformation right across the whole system and what that needs to look like if we're going to really challenge and shift this idea of kind of, you know, making people jump through hoops, making them prove themselves, and actually look at how we can give that choice and control. And there'll be some really key recommendations in our report about how we put people with lived experience back into control around some of that accountability and influencing within the system, because we know that those voices can be so powerful in spotting where the system's working and where it isn't. And finally, we can, if we coordinate the resources we have better across the whole county, and your own shift from Oxford to Oxfordshire Homeless Movement is highly timely within all that. And there's real movement and momentum, I hope and think, amongst the district councils and the city council now to really look at what that can mean. You know, how do we best make use of the housing resources, of the people, of the workforce, of the support provision, and most importantly, perhaps the community assets that we have right across the county. So I believe we can end homelessness and I really look forward to working with the movement over the coming weeks and months to try and bring about this vision. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Imogen. Really fascinating insight there, and a lot of topics and themes that I'm sure we'll pick up on with the interviews as we work through, and probably many of you will want to come back to on the question and answer session. So, without further ado, I'd like to invite Paul Roberts to unmute yourself and subject yourself to interview, Paul. Thank you for making the time, Paul. I think most people on the call will know you and will know Aspire and the huge amount of good work you do organisationally across homelessness and a whole range of other fronts. So given all that great work you're doing, why do you see the need for something like Oxfordshire Homeless Movement?
Thanks, Adrian. I think two things stand out as to why the Oxfordshire Homeless Movement is important. The first one, as we all know, homelessness is a complex, multifaceted issue. So alleviating it in a sustained, strategic, but still an urgent way can only be achieved through the organisations building relationships. I mean, they're collaborating, they're cooperating, they're innovating, and doing this around a shared purpose. So I think the movement facilitates this approach really well because it sits independently from any agency or local authority. So it allows the coming together of organisations around this common purpose, and we can start to see the results of that joint approach during the pandemic response. And then secondly, tackling homelessness should be seen as a shared problem that every organisation and person in Oxford and Oxfordshire should feel they can contribute something towards. And certainly other actors outside of the traditional housing departments and councils and homelessness charities. And the movement encourages that too. And this has been seen again in the response to the pandemic through voluntary effort, but also the colleges and other organisations stepping up to contribute.
Thank you. And picking up on, I mean, Imogen talked a lot about the importance of partnership working, and you just returned to it there. Can you give us some examples of some of the partnership working that's come out of OHM?
Yeah, I can. I think the way Oxford responded as a city to house people during the pandemic includes some really good examples of the movement's relationships and the partnership working in action. So, for example, University College and Side Business School both came forward quite early on in the lockdown phase to offer their empty accommodation, and they did that because they already held relationships through the movement. Pembroke College has been providing food and kitchen facilities throughout. Look at how Crisis and St Mungo's, Aspire, the City Council have all come together to support people into hotels, and then supporting people in the hotel settings. The movement again encouraged targeted donations of practical items to people in those settings. The Community Foundation, as part of the movement, funded Aspire to install temporary Wi-Fi in the hotels, as well as contribute towards some of the costs of our new Beckett Street project, where we've been refurbishing empty properties owned by a university college. And again, those relationships have formed as part of the movement. And yet more university colleges have donated surplus furniture and furnishings to the Beckett Street project. We've had companies coming in and with their employees to volunteer to paint and decorate, etc. So this framework of the movement and encouraging this mindset and approach of everybody pulling together, I think has really allowed this partnership to work in action practically when a crisis has thrust the need upon us.
And it sounds like, the complexity of organisations that I alluded to in one of my first slides is OHM has kind of put in place a network of relationships and connections there, which have then given rise to that potential for OHM and others to respond so positively to the pandemic.
Absolutely, yeah.
Excellent. And what can we expect in the future from OHM then? What innovations are there in the pipeline and new projects and new ideas?
Well, I think what's so appealing about the movement is that it's trying to focus on where are the gaps in provision strategically. And we know that there is a cohort of adults, for example, who have no recourse to public funds. So how do we provide them with a housing solution that's realistic and financially viable? So there's a number of organisations that have been coming through the mechanism of the movement to try and work towards bringing something online there. So hopefully we can start to see something on that front very soon. Imogen alluded to the concept of a social enterprise letting service in Oxfordshire. So that's again something that again the movement is encouraging. And I think perhaps, but something that I'm most proud of the movement undertaking and working towards is around really giving space and time and priority to the lived experience advisory forum and that voice and perspective. And with the new facilitator role being brought online, that paid role, which is being funded by the movement, I think that's another great example there.
And am I right, is that out to advert at the moment? So if anyone doesn't know, someone can post a link to that job in the chat box, because it'd be really good to get some good applications for that post. Impromptu plug there. Thank you, Paul. Any final thoughts before we move on to our next speaker?
No, just really pleased to be here and see such great attendance. Very happy to stick around for Q&As afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we are up to 149 people now attending, which is a record. Well, the only time we hit 100 in the past, we realised our Zoom license only allowed 100 people. So given we now moved to this system of sign-ups in advance, we were able to up our Zoom license to cope with the popularity of today's webinar. So thank you, Paul. And the next person I'd like to invite to speak and unmute yourself is Mon Gregory. Again, I think many of you will know Mon, and I think having worked across a number of sectors in voluntary statutory sector over the years, the voice of the people with lived experience is very important and often ignored or excluded or not taken into account because it's difficult to bring on board. And I'd really like to thank Mon for making the time today, because I know it can be quite challenging. I'm feeling slightly intimidated by the array of faces I'm looking at. So it's really good to have you here, Mon, and
thank you
for being prepared to share your story. So could you start by just telling us what the Lived Experience Advisory Forum is?
So Lived Experience Advisory Forum is a group of people with lived experience of homelessness and vulnerably housed, and we come together and we support people getting their voice heard over with different services where sometimes they feel that they're not being listened to by the services that they're working with. There's no trust between the worker or the person that you're working with, so it's like us bridging the gap between them and services.
So you're kind of supporting people who've got that lived experience to have the confidence in their voice and be part of the conversation.
Yeah, so it's like basically bridging the service, bridging the gap between the service and the service user. Sometimes they'll say to you, but we don't feel we're being listened to. We need to be listened. So to support somebody going through homelessness or being vulnerably housed, you need to be listened. You need to work with the trauma before you can actually work on housing somebody as well. Because they will need that constant care and support once they are moved from homelessness into a property. They still need that wraparound support, not just, oh, here you go, we're going to house you, off you go, and then there's no support, because this is where then they fall from the services and then they sort of fall into that trap with learning budgeting skills and stuff like that. They need that constant they need that constant wraparound support.
Yeah, so it's really important for the people who are experiencing homelessness or at risk to have their voice understood and their experience understood. What do you think OHM gains from having that voice and that influence as part of its thinking and part of its work?
So OHM is, LEAF is key part to the OHM of us getting the voices heard between OHM and the Lived Experience Forum, which is really good, and it's been amazing because a lot of people have come to me and they've asked me what OHM is, and so I just show them the website and tell them to go onto the website and have a look on the website where you can go and look for where you can go to help different organisations and what organisations are out there. Because sometimes my inbox is completely full of where do we go to get help, where do we, and it gets overwhelming sometimes. So I just obviously refer them to the OHM website.
I think we can all identify with the overflowing inbox experience.
Yeah, it gets overwhelming.
I can imagine. And the final question, what do you think lived experience can offer in terms of co-producing services?
So it's help services bridge the gap between the service user and their self, and helping them to get a different to learn a different platform of how to work with the client. Because sometimes you get a service and sometimes they don't know how to work with the client, and you've got to remember every client has got a different mental health issue, not all clients that come through the door are going to have the same mental health. So it's learning how to work with each individual separately and not the same. So it's helping to bridge that sort of gap.
Thank you. Well, I mean, it sounds like the work of LEAF is one important facet of all the work of OHM that is making those connections and bridging those gaps. So thank you, Mon, for taking the time today. Really appreciate it. If you're able to stick around if there are any questions, then that would be great. So thank you, everybody, for listening to the presentation, those two short interviews. Now we've got a lot of, I think, very experienced and interested people around the room, or the virtual room. So if you have a question you want to ask, please do raise your hand, either by clicking on the three dots, or and I'll share my screen again so we can see who's coming up. Or there are also, you can also use the chat box as well. Now, can you now see my screen, everybody?
We can just see the slides that you had on originally, Adrian.
Okay, so it's over to you, Q&A. Now, from here, I can't now find the chat box. And participants. So I think, in the absence of anyone putting their hand up, if Amanda Ponsonby is here, I think she may have a question. Amanda, are you here?
Yes.
Yes,
Can you hear me
excellent.
now?
Yes, I can hear you, Amanda.
Unmute myself. Well, a couple of questions, really. I suppose it was obviously so impressive how the council acted so quickly to get everybody off the street with everyone in. Imogen referred to the weather getting colder and emergency shelters needed this winter. Is the council going to contribute to that? Or I think in the past, is it the churches that open up to let people in the colder weather? And I wonder what provision, bearing in mind these COVID restrictions are getting harder and harder, what provision there is going to be in Oxford and Oxfordshire. I know it's Banbury and places as well.
I think we've got Paul Leo on the call. Paul, do you want to unmute yourself and give us an initial response to that?
Thank you, Adrian, and thank you for the question. Yeah, I mean, I should say, I mean, the City Council in particular obviously had to respond quickly to the Everyone In initiative. But I mean, as has already been said and Imogen referred to, I mean, it was a phenomenal cooperation. I mean, I've been so impressed, not just with many colleagues within this council, not just who worked in homelessness, but who worked for other parts of the council. And then, of course, all the voluntary groups and all sorts of people, you know, whether it's staff at hotels who would never have expected to find themselves in this position, and has been referred to, colleges, universities, and that. And I should say, until relatively recently, we were almost continually in crisis management. I'm not saying that the crisis is resolved, but we had almost sort of one cliff edge after another to tackle. First, to find the hotels, to find the food, to sort out the cleaning, to sort out all the other support that was needed. But then, as you know, it seemed only a very short time between the hotels were looking to open again, and we couldn't continue using them. And then we had to find other provision, and it's been referred to in the chat, but we now have provision, particularly at the YHA and Canterbury House, which was an Oxford Brookes student accommodation owned by A2 Dominion, which we now have. And just to move to the question that that Amanda's asked, particularly, we were fortunate. It didn't seem like it seemed the rabbit came out of the house with a hat with great cooperation from Brookes and A2D. to get Canterbury House, and we've also got the YHA for some time. And that's because we can't use communal settings at the moment. And at the moment, as we know, with the pandemic, apparently, you know, we're going through this quite considerable surge again. We can't use any of the communal settings, including the communal settings at Floyd's Row, which were specifically to increase the capacity that the City Council would have to cope with things like the winter extra demand over winter and cold weather. But because we have the Canterbury House accommodation for until next July and the YHA until the end of the financial year, we have got capacity at the moment, and the key is to keep people, I should say, this is not meant to be hostel, this is temporary accommodation, and we're working with the people. And again, Imogen's touched on this, one of the great things we've been able to do while people have been in accommodation is to engage more closely with them, to learn more about their circumstances. And we've been trying to use that as far as we can to move people on. And already scores of people have been moved on to more permanent accommodation. And the aim is to keep that going so that we actually free up more capacity within our existing accommodation, because we have to have single rooms, ideally with their own ensuite bathroom and toilet, because although it seems at the moment like we've been very fortunate because COVID hasn't been a major issue for the homeless population in Oxford, you only have to, and we've had many references to this, go over to parts of America, particularly Chicago, where homeless people have stayed in communal settings and COVID has run rampant through those populations. We haven't had that. So we're really anxious to keep the accommodation going and move people moving through. And in that way, we hope to be able to cope with more people coming onto the streets. It's still all very tense. It's all close, but it's certainly not a static situation. And you know, depending on how tough the winter is, we're at the moment feel we're in as good a place as we could be in the circumstances. I should say that it was said very early on about government saying, you know, what about university accommodation? And when we actually came to them and said, we've got university accommodation, but surprise, surprise, we have to commit to it for the whole academic year because we can't not. It really, the MHCLG, the government department, sort of hesitated a moment, but because I think we were in Oxford, were the first to actually secure this, and I have to say, I hope Brooks don't regret that now, given them what went on to happen. But the cooperation we got from Brooks was phenomenal, and from A2 Dominion, and we hope that we've got government support now for funding that all the way through to July with support. And with the great work done by Mungo's, I should say, you know, what was great about this is that Mungo's are a commissioned service, but they didn't act like a commissioned service during this. They acted as a charity who was just trying to resolve homelessness. And, you know, didn't go back to specifications saying that's not in our contract. They just got on and did it, as did people from Crisis as well, who were phenomenal during that. I'll stop there, Adrian, because I could go on and on about how you know, it was just an experience to watch this all happening. But I don't want to be complacent, but I think we're as good as a place as we can be looking across the country at this moment. But who knows what's going to happen in the next few weeks.
Thank you, Paul. And I think that speaks powerfully to what a positive response has been in many cases in Oxford, with people really, as you say, putting aside the job description or the contract and just getting on with what needed to be done in the circumstance. Now, we've got a couple of questions in the chat box around social lettings. So one is private landlords letting to charities who let to clients. How is that going? Who is involved? And how are they marketing it? How much potential does it have? And then I think pretty closely related to that, social enterprise lettings agency, how expensive, difficult would this be to set up, and who would run this? Paul, do you want to be the first person to respond on this? Others may want to chip in as well.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Adrian. I think the best thing to do is to point to examples in other parts of the UK where it is operating, to show how, and then it's trying to understand how replicable are these models to the Oxfordshire specific setting and to what the landlords and the demand in the market is like for Oxfordshire. So that's precisely what we intend to do in the months ahead, and to share the findings of a feasibility study within the homeless movement and to see if we can move forward with that kind of provision in Oxfordshire. So, for example, there's Homes for Good. I'll paste their website link into the chat box. Based in Glasgow, and there's a couple of others. So there's one around the sort of southwest Bristol area. I'll look it up and share that in the chat box too. So there's some examples already in other parts of the country that we can learn from. And there are other studies as well that Imogen Blood Associates have undertaken, like looking at a pan-London model, for example. So I think we can prove, or we can seek to prove for a feasibility study, A, that it's needed, B, that it can be delivered within Oxfordshire, and see that that is a financially viable proposition. And then if you can offer a low level of ongoing support to people, depending on how much support they need in those settings. So it's not going to be appropriate for everybody, no one's suggesting that, but it's just yet another addition to a wider model of provision. That means that we are maximising the use of the housing stock we've got in this county.
Thank you, Paul. Would anyone else like to come in? I mean, either from our panel or from the audience on that? We have other questions and comments. Imogen.
Just add a little bit on that potentially, yeah, just to say that some of the sorts of different models that could potentially stack up, I guess, are around looking at whether you can cross-subsidise by effectively sort of renting out to key workers and to other kind of professional groups. One of the kind of up in Homes for Good, what they've done there is that they've acquired a number of properties through social investment, and they then rent those out at local housing allowance, and alongside that also have a kind of, you know, a lettings agency that functions kind of renting out market properties and you know, offering a fair and transparent service to landlords, but also obviously making a return on that. And within our London model, we also looked at the idea of kind of leasing and whether there's an appetite amongst perhaps sort of smaller landlords, perhaps you sort of accidental landlords, to actually kind of lease to an organisation on a kind of slightly longer term lease, taking perhaps a slightly reduced amount from what they might get on the market, but knowing that you know, that rent is guaranteed and there'll be no you know, gaps between tenants, and if there are any issues with the properties, those will be put right. So really sort of looking at whether there's a combination of those models that can kind of stack up in different parts of the Oxfordshire housing market, or potentially further afield from Oxfordshire, to make a kind of model which can potentially work, possibly drawing on some sort of social enterprise charitable funding as well. Thanks.
Thank you. And then a question about the rising demand for women without a home and what's being done to address that in Oxford. I don't know who's best placed to come in on that.
I just want to say that our intention is that there are 5 blocks of empty residential properties that we have signed a lease for from one of the university colleges. We've already brought online 2 of those blocks, and they're now being used for move-on housing. One of the blocks we will be dedicating to a women-only project, so that will provide a 7-bed property for women that we hope to bring online by the middle of November. And that's in part in recognition that there is a distinct lack of women's that gender-informed service.
Thank you, Paul. Now I think Margaret Simpson, have you raised your hand in some way? Yes. And you're unmuted, please.
Yes, thank you, Adrian. I find this very interesting because during the 90s, I actually managed a scheme in Oxford for homeless men, and it was also a thing when I first came into Oxford. And it is rather sad to say that 20 years later, we are still discussing the same problem. But what I would like to ask, and Monica herself mentioned it, was that yes, we could provide, it was then hostel type accommodation, and we had supported housing officers who worked with everybody and tried to get them ready to be able to move on, because we had move on accommodation around various places in the city. But it's the revolving door syndrome. You can place somebody in their own flat, but unless you actually have staff that are going in to support, that quite easily and very quickly can deteriorate, because people don't necessarily have the financial means of going out and socialising, they perhaps don't have the skills to socialise. So could I ask Paul and Imogen, have you actually got a very good extent to be able to support people for what could be quite a long period of time in their rehoming? It's not something that actually will happen overnight. Thank you.
Imogen, Paul, who wants to come in on that first?
Say a little bit if you like. Yes, no, absolutely critical point, definitely. And the last thing anybody wants is for anybody to be set up to fail by moving somebody into an independent tenancy. And we all know that living alone isn't for everybody and can be quite isolating for people. And I think you've absolutely hit the nail on the head that the key to getting this right will be to get the right combination of commission support. And I spoke in my presentation very briefly about this need to decouple some of the support provision, obviously not all of it, but some of the support provision from buildings-based projects, because at the moment you can sort of only get the support, well, there are some excellent floating support services, but the vast majority of commission support is linked to staying within a particular building. So we need to try and come up with models that allow more flexibility so that more of that support can follow the individual rather than be linked to the tenancy or linked to the building. So that's part of it, but also, as you rightly alluded, you know, the real knack is going to be to link that to what is already out there as a massive kind of load of assets across the county. I mean, we were really struck in coronavirus by the Oxford hubs, the whole coming together, the community larders network. You know, I've just been talking to Health Now about their social prescribers. We know there are kind of peer networks, and that there's also a whole other rake of kind of infrastructure. I mean, the old fire station, the arts offer, the kind of mainstream lifeblood of the city and the county, really. So it's sort of, how do we mesh that together for individuals, both at that individual level, but also strategically to create that kind of package of support that people need, that can reintegrate them back into sort of normal life, as well as give them that kind of formal visiting support for the period that they need it. And I think the really key thing there is about that kind of as long as they need it, because inevitably now we tend to, you know, it's very difficult when you've got limited resources. You tend to commission things for kind of blocks of time. It's an hour a week or 3 hours a week for 2 months or 6 months. And it's how can we kind of move our whole way of thinking about commissioning to something that's actually much more flexible. Easily said, difficult to do, but I think that's where we really need to focus our energy.
Thank you. Paul, did you have anything to add on that, or anyone else?
I just want to add that there's also very much a focus around housing first, and seeing housing first as a delivery model more commonplace and more of the norm, and that is very much providing that intensive support relationship to individuals in those settings, and we've been working with some great partners, including Soha Housing, to try and demonstrate how that can work in the county, in the districts as well. So people will need varying levels of intensity of support depending on their recovery and their personal resilience. So we've got to design the models that fit around that reality.
Sorry, can I just say something as well? Sorry, my name's Sam Gill. I'm a hotelier actually that helped out during the COVID period. I housed 2 hotels full of homeless, actually, one near Windsor and one in South Oxfordshire near Henley-on-Thames. I mean, for me, it's been a very humbling experience to have housed these individuals and listen to their stories. But one of the things that really I discussed with my family was that we would maybe take one of our hotels and convert them into 2 parts, where we would convert one into short-term housing and the other into mini apartments, where they've got a kitchenette and a lounge area as well as a bedroom. But I've been finding it very difficult to speak with councils in terms of getting that approved, or even getting the thought out there, or someone to consider it. And I'm willing to invest more money into buying properties where we can do that, where we can do a 2-stage process, where we've got short-term and long-term, but through separate entrances, but within one building, which means that it allows you to have support on site, and it makes it more cost effective to have the support on site. Is that of interest?
Thank you, Sam. I think it's definitely of interest. I know south of the county, Henley, a little bit. Bits of Henley are in Oxfordshire and bits of it are over the border in Berkshire. So
Correct.
For us, it would depend which side of the river you are. But certainly a conversation that we'd be happy to have outside of this. And I'm sure there'll be people in Berkshire that would be interested to link in and pick up on that offer. But it's I think it's really humbling how well so many businesses have responded through the lockdown, and great to hear your story. So thank you for sharing. I'm hoping to fit in at least one more question. We've got several people asking about vacant homes and whether we're linking in with people like Action on Empty Homes and Global Guardians. Quick responses on that, anybody?
Shall I just pick that one up? Because that was one of the things that I was wondering, having heard various webinars on it. We've got fantastic resources within Oxfordshire, and actually there's been fantastic coordination within the system. It's just there are also some really big national initiatives which are very powerful, thinking about the numbers of buildings which are not being used. So for example, there's going to be a lot of office blocks and unusual buildings which will not be used for some extended time because of COVID, because firms are not using them anymore. So that there is a national movement called the Action on Empty Homes, which is just, it's partly campaigning about how we need to think about making really much better use of empty homes, but is also actively drawing together resource and ideas about how to invest in empty properties which have been empty for years and otherwise are just not getting used at all. And the other initiative, which is quite interesting, is the whole movement around property guardians. So where you've got buildings which are likely to be empty for a long time and might not be conventional housing, you can actually employ somebody who's homeless to work within that building and act as a kind of guardian for that property. And in return for that, they get a really low rent, and the property guardian agencies then create a really secure, comfortable, reasonable living space for somebody within that building. It's just that there are some quite creative thinking going on nationally about using these empty and unconventional spaces. So it wasn't to say that we're not doing it, it was just to prompt that it's always worth a thought.
Thank you, Helen. And that's really appreciated, and I'm sure that will be food for thought if it's not already in people's minds. I am going to have to wind up there, although there's a lot of interesting questions and comments in the chat. So thank you everybody for those, and I'm sorry we haven't got time. I am going to make time to hand back to Jane Cranston briefly, who I know would like to say a few words, and I know who talked before taking on the role of, or when she took on the role of High Sheriff, about how struck she was about the differences between the haves and the have-nots in Oxfordshire, which is something I know we've all pondered on a lot. But Jane, if you would like to unmute yourself, and I will give you the final words for our webinar.
Thank you. It's always nice to be allowed the final word, isn't it? Just before I do, can I thank everybody, Imogen, Paul, especially Mon, and OCF for making this happen today. It's a lot of people listening are very much in the sector and will know some of the questions and answers, but hopefully there are some new people out there who are learning more that they didn't know, and how they can help, and that the role of the homeless movement is to, if you like, unconfuse the issue for you. So if you've got questions and queries, please do send them, or good ideas, please do send them through to us and we will help. So very, very many thanks to OCF, Imogen and all for that today. But as I say, my special thanks for being allowed to have this last couple of minutes to put out a plea for some support. Clearly, really clearly, the key players, the commissioners of services and the funders for the sector are, and I guess always will continue, both national and local governments. And our own city council and the county councils have done a really phenomenal job over the last months when the everyone in call went out. So first of all, thanks to them. But it's equally clear to me that as a society, as a wider society, we cannot and we absolutely must not lose sight of the parts that we can all as both individuals and organisations, but we can and need to play in making Oxfordshire a fairer and better county. We need to ensure that we pay decent wages. We need to ensure that we use spare space, either whilst it's waiting to be developed, or it could be available for the longer term. And to use our own skills for supporting the benefit of charities and individuals who are less fortunate than ourselves. And whilst I'm speaking, they've put up on the screen there, which gives you some headline areas in which you can help. And please do email hello@oxfordshirehomelessmovement.org, both with the questions that you've not been able to ask today, or the ideas, Mr. Gill, please do, that you'd like to share with us, so that we can put you in touch with people who are perhaps not as big as the council or crisis or shelter, or those who are doing more national and big things. There's lots of very, very good small organisations in Oxford or in Oxfordshire who would leap at some of the opportunities that I know that can get offered. So please do share your ideas, or go online to oxfordshirehomelessmovement.org for more information. As always, there is always an ask involved with these things, and our immediate ask is for either all or a contribution towards some 3-year funding for the homeless movement itself. £50,000 a year would cover the movement's current core costs, and securing core funding would ensure that we're able to continue to reach out to, support, lead and help all our 38 members. And many of them, as I say, are very small, and they can fill in those gaps that things that are falling through other places. We keep our core cost to a minimum by being able to use OCF as a host organisation, and by using the time and energy, skills and commitment from many of those of our members who give us a lot of time and energy to support the wider movement. But core costs there are nonetheless. Salaries do need to be paid. So if anybody out there knows of anybody who could support us, please let us know. And you've already heard, I think Paul in particular mentioned that we're currently also supporting the Lived Experience Advisory Forum, and that is absolutely key to what we do. I think historically there's been a great deal of people having a great many ideas about what they need. Actually, it isn't they. It's human beings, it's individuals. It could be any one of us. So many people are one paycheck away from not being able to pay the rent. That's what you need to remember. Again, maybe a tendency to think that people have brought their problems on themselves. Believe you me, some may have, but most haven't. Most it's circumstantial, and they need the support. So people like Mon and her colleagues at the Lived Experience Forum are absolutely invaluable to what we're going ahead. We are helping support the formation of a social lettings agency, which has been touched on. So please do contact us about that. And looking for ways to support, for example, asylum seekers who are waiting to have their applications renewed. So those who have no recourse to public funds. And all these need fundings. We can't do anything without funding. We all tend to duck it, and I get told off by others for, you shouldn't be asking for money. Actually, you have to have it. And those of us who've got some or got spare space, we need to be aware of that. The objective of our movement is to work even more effectively, bringing people together across Oxfordshire, again guided by our friends at LEAF, to develop the ones I've mentioned and other new initiatives that fill these critical missing gaps between services. And our goal is to reduce, or obviously even better still, to help prevent in the first place, rough sleeping. Rough sleeping is only the tip of the iceberg. Somebody mentioned the figure 4,000 people requiring support. There are people who are sofa surfing. There are people in very poor accommodation. There are people sleeping in their cars. Rough sleeping is the tip of the iceberg, absolutely the tip of the iceberg. But we can't do any of that. We can't do any of that without help and support of the wider community, both financial and otherwise. So please remember that too. So if you know of any organisations, individuals, grant-giving bodies, philanthropists who are not already supporting our members directly, and please do keep supporting them directly, send them our way, and we can advise and guide them as to where their money can best be directed. And there are a plethora of ideas out there. And just finally, COVID-19 and the government's everyone in policy has given us both nationally and locally a unique opportunity to tackle homelessness. There are people who've come in who haven't been inside for years and who are recognising that actually they can accept support and help. They've been let down before by the system, but we don't want to let them again. So please help us not to waste this opportunity. And my final word is that for the Oxfordshire Homeless Movement, charity begins not at home, but with a home. And if you can help us, please, please do. So thank you for coming today. Thank you, OCF, for letting us have this forum. And thank you to all those who've contributed. And goodbye.
Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Mon. Thank you, Imogen. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, everybody, for coming along. It's been a fascinating hour of conversation. We will share videos and the chat and try and keep the conversation going as best we can. And we will be back here on the 11th of November to talk about closing the attainment gap. Thank you very much and have a good afternoon.